a gavel. Great fever going on here. But you have all demonstrated that you value being here for a rough cut more than you value an hour spent outside today, which is the right choice. So we have one more rough cut this semester next week, so please come back to that. We are starting to put together our calendar for the fall, so if you're interested in presenting, please let me or Emma know. Let's try to get a little bit of a mix of different kinds of people. But we will be probably reaching out soon to a call for people who would like to present. This week we have Rob Payn presenting. Rob is an assistant professor of watershed hydrology here at Montana State in the Department of Land Resources and Environmental Sciences. He first came here in 2009 as a postdoc and then transitioned into his current position. He has a PhD in hydrology from the Colorado School of Mines, an MS in biology from Virginia Tech, and a BS in electrical engineering from the Ohio State University. And his lab focuses on how water moves through a system and how that affects ecosystem structure and function, integrating hydrology and ecology and biogeochemistry and social sciences. He's got a couple of PhD students working in his lab, visiting research professor, and going to have an undergrad working with you this summer. Is that right?
Yeah.
Good.
At least one.
All right. Good. So welcome, Rob, and take it away.
Thanks, Rich, and thank you all for coming. I know it's getting to a crazy time in the semester. It's nice to see an almost full room. I chose a strategy where I want to talk a little bit about a lot of things rather than vice versa. I want to tell you a lot about what's going on in my lab, so I wanted to cover all of the different projects going on now. They're all relatively in their early stages, so I'm going to be talking more about ideas than I am about data at this point. I do have a little data I can show you, but not a whole lot, and certainly not much that we can make strong conclusions on. So I hope you're ready for a ride through a lot of ideas in a hurry. As you might have been able to tell from my title, I decided to organize my talk based on a decomposition of how I think about watershed hydrology, and in particular, how I think about watershed hydrology in the Intermountain West, or in the western part of Montana. So I'm going to break it down into mountain headwaters, intermountain basins, alluvial floodplains. I'll talk more about what those mean in a minute. And I'll be giving an example of a study in each one of those categories in terms of work that's going on in my lab. And if I have time at the end, which will be a minor miracle, I'm going to talk a little bit about my views on big data and what we need to apply big data practices in environmental science. So this is the Upper Missouri watershed as it is pictured in the Montana State Water Plan. It's one of the big watersheds that is the organizational structure for the water plan and talking about different issues in different parts of the state. When I got a faculty position here, I was starting to think about Montana hydrology. I started looking at maps like this and looking at the goals that were in the water plan and trying to think, how do I want to break down a watershed in order to attain these goals? So the divide and conquer idea, that's how most distributed watershed modelers think, is breaking it down. In this case, I want to use the concept of a process domain. Now, this is not a new concept. It's a concept that comes out of geomorphology. And a pretty hardcore geomorphologist named David Montgomery published this paper in the Journal of the American Water Resources Association, which is a highly applied hydrological journal. So I read that to mean that this is a letter from geomorphologists to hydrologists in terms of how they should be rethinking how they break up systems and thinking about how water moves in those systems. So I've really fallen in love with this idea, and I've been talking about process domains ever since I got my master's degree. It's been a major theme of all of my defense talks and job talks, everything. So I'm going to go with that theme. And the way that I broke down this watershed were things that were pretty clearly discernible on the map to begin with. First, mountain headwaters. These are the mountainous regions that are characterized by high relief, shallow soils. This is kind of the breeding ground of most hydrologic theory in terms of conventional hydrologic theory. The hydrograph is dominated by snow storage, so you see a big seasonal storage pulse of water based on the water that's frozen in snow. It's a primary water supply for Bozeman, so about 80% of our drinking water comes from mountain headwaters. So Some of the issues in terms of the state water plan is dealing with changes in the snowmelt timing and in the rain to snow ratios that we're likely to see with climate change in the coming decades. And also with an increase in aridity, we're expecting an increase in the frequency of fire. And we want to understand that as well. Now in between these mountains, we also have these regions with a distinctly different geomorphological process domain. And that is these Intermountain Basins. We live in one, the Gallatin Valley. The picture here is an example from the Judith Basin. So this is a much lower relief landscape. It's characterized hydrologically by redistribution of the water that's coming from those mountain headwater inputs. So some water falls directly on these, but a lot of the water that's coming into the system is coming from the mountain front in the form of stream water. It's also the area where we have much more direct coupling between the hydrologic system and human systems, particularly in terms of agriculture, where dryland agricultural folks are thinking hard about the water that they get from precipitation and managing that well, or irrigators that are thinking about how to use either the stream water or the groundwater to raise crops. Finally, one that you can't see that well on the map, but it's also very distinct if you zoom in, are these alluvial floodplains. So this is a picture of the Gallatin River down here in the Gallatin Valley. And you don't have to be a hydrologist to be able to draw some pretty distinct lines around that in terms of a system that is operating in a different process domain. The sediments in the system are turning over at a much more rapid pace than the sediments around them. And that creates a distinct hydrologic system that we call a river or a riparian system. It's characterized by bidirectional movement between the surface water and the groundwater in that system, and frequently at multiple different scales. It's a frequent target of restoration efforts in terms of thinking about how to get our systems back to where they used to be. There's a big emphasis in Montana on fishing and having good fish habitat. And also, it's recently been a focus of natural storage, which I'm going to talk about in more detail in a little bit. Now, hydrologically speaking, alluvial floodplains are a little complicated to think about because they're interlaced into the other process domains. You have the big ones down here in the Intermountain Basins. They get smaller and smaller as you get up into the mountains. And it makes it a system that's particularly hard to understand how they operate at a watershed scale. We know a lot about how they operate over individual reaches, but we don't know that much about how we scale that up. So as I started thinking about these ideas, I said, well, this is really a repeated pattern that you see all across the Intermountain West. This pattern of mountain headwaters, intermountain basins, and alluvial systems that all are going to have their impacts on water quality and quantity. And I drew this little cartoon in my maze proposal to try to get that across. I said, hey, that was kind of cool, so I adopted it as my logo for my lab. So this thing is actually loaded with symbology that means something. These are the two different process domains. There's the mountain headwaters up here. I've got them going from white to dark green. White to signify the impact of snow, dark green to signify the vegetation, that's evergreens. Down here in the valleys, we have the golden color, like the Golden Triangle, or the Intermountain, where you see the golden wheat. You see it getting greener and greener as you get closer to the stream. And then to designate the fact that the alluvial system has a disproportional influence relative to its area, I made this more of an equal area representation of the impact on water quality and quantity. I made it much bigger than it would be by scale, so you could see it and think about its nature. If we break our systems down into this really simple fundamental hydrologic unit, we can start thinking about the upstream causality, so looking from the stream into the watershed to understand the controls on stream water quantity and quality, or downstream effects. We can take a terrestrial perspective to think, how does this landscape affect the connected stream system? And this gives us sort of a tinker toy that you could put together the West, these fundamental units that you could rebuild the Intermountain West with. At least that's the idea. So I'd like to go through these three different process domains and talk about a little bit of new research that I've started in each of these with lots of other people. So I'm going to talk about the mountain headwaters first. I'm going to talk about a project that we're starting up at Big Sky, in the Big Sky Resort area. That's the watershed of the West Fork of the Gallatin River. Wyatt Cross is a professor in the ecology department that I'm collaborating with. Meryl Storb is a PhD student in my lab who's heading up this project. And I also have a visiting scientist, Juliana Dandrilli, that is working on some DOM qualification that I'll talk, or characterization that I'll talk about in a little bit. and some undergraduate scholars and undergraduate helpers. And I'm also collaborating with Kristen Gardner from the Gallatin River Task Force. So the motivation of this project came from thinking about the effects of climate change on ecosystems. And I think we're all pretty familiar with this kind of feedback loop, where we think about how climate change can change the trajectory of an ecosystem, but because climate change is driven by carbon in the atmosphere, the biological processes in that ecosystem can feed back on climate change, perhaps the most obvious example being the melting of the permafrost and the respiration of the organic matter trapped in the permafrost, possibly adding CO2 to the atmosphere. But in systems where humans have a strong effect, we might see the effects of climate change more strongly through the lens of land use and what humans decide to do in reaction to climate change or not in reaction to climate change. And if we're going to get into that, we have to think about how human decisions affect that land use and whether that decision has a positive or benefit effect in terms of whether it makes that a sustainable or not sustainable use of that ecosystem. I think we'd all like to see human decisions come more from what we know about climate change, but what seems to happen more often is we react to disasters, right? We react. It's a reactionary process when we make these decisions. So this is another feedback loop that I think is important to study in the context of climate change, and we think that Big Sky is a good place to do that. I would need some help from either social scientists or economists to think about the human decision angle of this, but in terms of environmental science, I think I've got the toolkit to work on this part of the system. We are focusing, in terms of the ecosystem trajectory, we want to think about that in terms of the metabolic regimes of the stream system. In terms of metabolic regimes, we're talking about whole ecosystem primary production. That's the transformation of inorganic carbon to organic carbon through primary production, mostly photosynthesis in our system, or respiration, like aerobic respiration, which is turning organic carbon back into inorganic carbon to get energy. We want to think about that as our primary response variable. We think it's going to be a good integrative response variable, number one, because it's in the stream, and the stream is already an integrative location in the watershed because of all of the terrestrial system linked to that outlet that stream reach represents. And also because we're talking about the foundation of energetics of the ecological system, the production of organic matter or turning organic matter back into inorganic matter. Now this idea of thinking about a metabolic regime or metabolism over time in a continuous way is not is something we've only recently been able to do in streams. This is a seminal paper by Brian Roberts et al. Back in 2006. And to my knowledge, this is the first publication of regular estimates of whole stream metabolism over time over more than 1 year. This is in Walker Branch in Tennessee. And what this kind of data gives us, the way to think about how the stream behaves on an annual basis on a whole. Like if you were just to sample once during a season, you would have a hard time integrating under that curve to understand what the total carbon balance is of that stream. But as soon as you are sampling every day, you can integrate under that curve and you can think about total carbon balances in the system. So we have gross primary production, the positive numbers here, and you can see the peaks that are in the spring, which is when it starts getting warm, but the leaves don't come out yet. That's when primary producers really crank up, and you can see those peaks, and you can integrate under that curve to find out how much carbon those primary producers are fixing during that time. You can also see the peaks in respiration, more negative numbers or higher respiration in the fall during leaf. We can also tie the stream to the atmosphere this way. This is net ecosystem production. If you take these negative numbers, it's the same thing as net NEE, I forget what the middle E, exchange. Net ecosystem exchange, which is how much carbon is this system putting into the atmosphere. Now the idea that we can use these metabolism regimes is catching on. We're seeing more and more continuous data about stream metabolism, both in the context of thinking about climate change and in the context of thinking about the effects of stream restoration. And we think that we can contribute to this thread of literature in a system like Big Sky. And where we can contribute is thinking about these links between land use and climate change and how they might interact in the system. We have to narrow down our independent variables. to do science, we have to know what we're thinking about our causal factors are in terms of making some hypotheses. So the pathways of causality we're thinking about are two pathways tied to climate change. First of all, climate change is directly going to affect the temperature. So applying metabolic theory of ecology, you would expect an increase in temperature should yield increase in metabolic rates. However, whenever you go out into a real system, it gets a lot harder to find the effects of temperature directly because of all the other confounding effects that might create changes. So one of the things we think is also important in our system is the change in the hydrologic regime. If we get earlier snowmelt, we would expect to have longer growing seasons for the algae in the stream. So if we're thinking about total production over a year, the effects of a slight increase in temperature might be minimal compared to the increase of the growing season that might be increased by as much as weeks to months of the year. And finally, in terms of land use, we have narrowed that down in our system to nitrogen loading. So we're thinking about the effects of development in the Big Sky catchment on nitrogen loading to the stream. So a few more notes on why Big Sky is a good place to hypothesize and test questions about these relationships. First of all, there's been past research, sorry about that, went too fast. There's been past research up in Big Sky led by Kristen Gardner when she was getting her PhD with Brian McGlynn, thinking about nitrogen loading in that system and its ties to things like septic systems or the golf courses. So we have a lot of past research and monitoring on nitrogen loading in that system that Kristen has continued in her position as the director of the Gallatin River Task Force. This is an example of some of the work she did for her PhD. If you look at the dormant season, we have higher nitrate concentrations near the outlet. And if you look during the growing season, you see lower nitrate concentrations in the same location. And that gives us a suggestion that nitrogen is limiting the system during the growing season. We're seeing the nitrogen getting taken up by the algae in that system during the growing season. So we have some idea that we have areas in this watershed where we can think about nitrogen limitation and look at the effects of nutrient loading on that metabolism. I think one of the bigger aspects of thinking about working at Big Sky is the perfect storm of factors. We have a combination of high elevation, where you're going to see the earlier and most strongest effects of climate change on both the hydrology and the temperature of the system. And also we happen to have a system where they're building houses in unreasonable places. So we've got a ton of development going on up there that gives us a chance to really study these interactions in a system where we'll see changes of climate change sooner. Some more pragmatic reasons to work at Big Sky are the kind of support we get there from Kristen and the Gallatin River Task Force. Gallatin River Task Force is an NGO. They're a community-run organization that looks as themselves as watchdogs of the Gallatin River and the quality of water in that river. So they've been running community-based sampling campaigns for monitoring water quality, and they also maintain several stream gauges in the system. And also, serendipitously, the Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology's groundwater investigations program has been doing a big project up there to characterize groundwater in their system. They are focused in on the meadow aquifer and trying to understand how that aquifer can be used sustainably for the growing development up there and whether there's other sources of water to support that development. So taking all these things together, we think we have a system that's set up well to answer a few questions of interest, like how does variation in metabolism with temperature compare to metabolic theory? Can we find an indication in the environment? For example, gross primary production normalized to the biomass in the system. Does that show us patterns that would suggest that metabolic rates are controlled by temperature, or strongly controlled by temperatures in the system? If we do some simulations or some extrapolations to think about how the flow regime might change with climate change, can we think about how extension of that growing season with the metabolic rates we measure would combine to tell us how much total carbon flux there might be in that system over a whole growing season, and how that increase due to the change in growing season might compare to increases in that are driven by temperature. And finally, if we look at streams that are subject to nutrient loading versus not subject to nutrient loading, we can think about how both those climate and temperatures might interact with the nutrient loading in that system. So that's a very quick version of the project, but I'm going to go ahead and plug Meryl's talk that's coming up on Monday. She's going to go into much more detail about her ideas for her dissertation research proposal tied to these ideas. If you can't make it at 1:10 p.m. on Monday, there will be a video available online on the LRES webpage at some point after the presentation. Another angle that we've started recently up at Big Sky is thinking about the information that might be available in DOM, and this is something Juliana Dandrilli is helping me out with immensely, teaching me a lot. I learned a lot just in the last few days to make sure I don't sound like an idiot right now. This is all based on the idea that simply by measuring the fluorescence of dissolved organic matter, you can get some sense of what kind of organic matter that you're looking at. So this is a graph from a seminal paper from Diane McKnight et al. Back in 2001. The paper's been cited over 1,000 times. It's looking at DOM in freshwater systems, specifically fulvic acids, and thinking about what is the organic structure of those fulvic acids and how do they differ among different streams or different lakes, different systems. This particular fluorescence index is the ratio of two emission frequencies as a result of a single excitation frequency. And on the x-axis is aromaticity, which is measured by nuclear magnetic resonance methods, which is a very expensive but accurate and reliable way of thinking about the structure of those organic molecules. And using relationships like the one McKnight and all have put together here in this graph, we can start thinking about how different organic matter might come from different parts of the system. For example, the little diamonds tend to be in this part of the graph, and those signify microbially derived organic matter, versus terrestrially derived organic matter, which are the black circles, which tend to fall over here. And what goes along with that is these tend to be more labile forms of carbon, and these tend to be more refractory forms of carbon. So these all are tied back into metabolism. And by looking at patterns in these organic molecules, we think we can get additional source of information about the nature of metabolism in these systems. Now, if you start thinking about this idea, it's like, well, if we think that information is available from two frequencies, why not look at all the frequencies? So you can take all of the excitation frequencies, bombard your sample with those, look at all the emissions that come off of each one, and you get this thing that's called an excitation emission matrix, or an EAM. And the idea is there's information in this map of the different intensities in the emission frequencies you get from these excitations to tell you about the organic matter. And of course, the next thing that you probably want to do is compare data from these across sites. What's about that is that each combination of excitation and emission is like one variable that you have to compare. So you have an extremely hyperdimensional problem here in terms of trying to analyze your data. So we can use tools that are similar to principal components analysis to deal with that. In this case, the most popular tool is called a parallel factor analysis, or a parafac, but it's very analogous to principal components analysis. And the idea is that you want to find the regions of this map that best describe the variability in your samples. And that's what parafac will tell you. And these act just like components in a principal component analysis. And they're also ranked, C1, 2, 3, 4. So C1 tells you the most about the variation in your samples, C2 the next most, C3, and so on. Instead of looking at these in some sort of projection space, what we do is look at the maps of each of these. So these are the excitation emission pairings that do the best job of describing the variation. And then once you have that, you also have a tensor that's going to describe how much each one of these describes the variation in each sample. And you can pull that out, that one number, and then start comparing those across sites. So we could say, how much do these 4 samples have of this component at these 4 locations at 3 different times of the year? What we have here are the blue curves are above the golf course. The blue bars are above the golf course. The green bars are below the golf course. So we think there should be an effect of nitrogen loading between these 2 points. And also all of our reaches have an upstream and a downstream end. So we have variation between the upstream and downstream end of each reach. And those reaches are on either side of the golf course. So some general patterns that we can see here are the higher organic matter intensities that we see in the summertime, with the exception of C4, which I haven't had a chance to talk to Julianne about yet, if there's a good reason for that, or we don't know. So that's just an indication that we're seeing more organic matter of these types in the summer. The other thing is these components tend to fall out, again, along those lines of labile versus refractory. So C1, 3, and 4 tend to be tied to microbial sources of carbon, and those tend to be more labile. C2 is a high molecular weight humic substance, and those tend to be tied to terrestrial sources and tend to be more refractory. So right now we're seeing increases of both the refractory and the more labile forms in the summer. Don't really have strong conclusions about that yet because this, is pretty hot off the press. I think I just got this 2 days ago. But Juliana should have more real soon because she's got to give a talk at SFS next month. So. Okay, so moving on to the Intermountain Basin process domain, about a project that, a proposal writing effort that was led by Stephanie Ewing that I participated in. We have some collaborators with the USGS, James Paces and Rob Striegel, and also other folks here. Jane Clausen is a co-PI from the Environmental Analysis Lab. Erica Stern, I've stolen a bunch of her slides that you'll see in a minute, who I think is here. Yes, she's here. And Ethan Willogo has helped with the lab, and I'm probably missing names here that I should have, but that's the way it goes. So the hydrologic idea portion of this proposal is based on how we think about the general movement of water in this Intermountain Basin system. So I'm going to use the Gallatin Valley as an example. So this is south. This is the front of the Gallatin Range. Here are the Bridgers. You can see Bozeman there. And you can see that these, again, these differences are pretty evident, even in a Google Earth image. So we're looking at that transition from the mountain headwater process domain into the Intermountain Basin process domain. And I want to think about how water moves between those. I want to think about, as it's moving, how does it end up back in the rivers? So this is the Gallatin River and the East Fork of the Gallatin River. So I want to think about these three streams. This is South Cottonwood, Highlight, and Sourdough Creeks. As they go across that transition out into the Intermountain Basin, it becomes a more divergent hydrologic system, and that's both divergent horizontally and divergent vertically. So more of the water is going to end up in groundwater. As they come out of that system, they come out onto a more level landscape. And what that means is there's a lot of water potentially moving from that system, from that process domain, back into the watershed process domain, into the groundwater, the regional groundwater system. Now this is really important from a fundamental hydrologic perspective because most conventional hydrologic models can't even simulate that. Once the water is in the stream, it's in a routing model. It just leaves the catchment according to that routing model. There's no way that water can get back into a groundwater reservoir again. So that's one of the reasons that I think this kind of system can really inform fundamental hydrology because we need to figure out hydrologic models that can simulate that properly before we could really make good decisions about how to manage these aquifers in these intermountain basins. As you move through that system, that groundwater system, the groundwater table is going to reorganize itself back into a convergent system. And you know that there's convergent systems because you can see these springs popping out all over the place as you get closer to the streams and the rivers down here in the basin. And if you have that kind of focused flow, there must be some sort of convergence behind it. And also, as humans, we have exaggerated this divergent effect at the mountain front, mostly with these unlined ditch systems that we use for flood irrigation. So there's a big flood irrigation ditch that is diverted somewhere near Gallatin Gateway, and it just follows this topographic contour along the foothills of the Madison Range. And that ditch is unlined, so what you expect that is increasing the amount of water, the amount of time for water to infiltrate from that system into that groundwater, recharging that groundwater that ultimately discharges back into the river. And this, again, is a repeated pattern. You see this kind of irrigation ditch all over the place in the Intermountain West. I was just talking to Scott Payn about how big this is over in the lower Ruby and got a good tour looking at the effects. So how do we go after understanding that hydrologic system? Well, Stephanie's idea is to think about the weathering products and the water quality and think about what that can tell us about how the water moves. Ultimately, what solutes that you see in the stream water are going to be a function of where the stream is connected to the groundwater resources where the weathering is happening. And as you move through the system, you're changing in the geologic substrate, geologic bedrock, as well as the sedimentary depositions on top of that. So we can move from volcanics to limestones to gneiss to alluvium here in the valley. And we think that we can find patterns in the weathering products that will tell us something about how the water in the stream is connected back to those sources of water. So one way to think about this in a bit of a cartoon figure here is if we look at elevation on our x-axis and we look at some of these weathering products like calcium, strontium, pH, and the calcium to strontium ratio, we can make some hypotheses about how we'll see patterns in these weathering products with that elevation. Based on these ideas that you're going to see different calcium-strontium ratios for these different weathering rocks. And I apologize right now, Erica, I took some license with that, so I have a slightly different hypothesis from yours. And we can mark on this graph where this process domain transition is in our elevation. So we have the mountains at the higher elevations, the Intermountain Basin at the lower elevations. We would expect as we move, we're going to start with low calcium to strontium ratios because we have more volcanics there, less limestone. We build up to this boundary. Now in this boundary, we might hit a region after we transition out of that boundary where there's less water coming into the system. Remember I said it's a divergent system there, right? When you go across that boundary. Well, if you're losing water dominantly, you're not going to have much effect on your chemistry. You're not going to have more water coming in, changing your chemistry. So maybe you would expect a flat spot in this pattern because of that lack of connection with sources of more highly weathered, showing more highly weathered signal. And then that might pick up again as you see the water start to converge back on the stream. So this is a slightly alternate hypothesis to Erica's, but of course neither of our hypotheses necessarily work out that great. Erica's with a straight line through there, by the way. We see, if you squint at this, you can see that gaining pattern in the headwaters, which makes sense, but things kind of fall apart a little bit when you get down here in the valley. This could be for lots of reasons. These could be local effects that might control things in particular situations. We aren't looking at just one flow path here, so you could have variation among flow paths that might confound or distort that pattern. But these are not unexpected results necessarily, because you would also expect a lot of mixing to happen. So things here tend to show up like less, which are the deposits that we have down here in the valley. So this is not necessarily unexpected, and it's some preliminary data, and we have a proposal to get more data. We're also adding uranium to the list of our analytes to help us think about how these weathering products might tell us more about this system. Erica already gave her talk, but if you're interested in a much better version of this with more details, you can find her talk online by going to the LRES webpage as well. Finally, a little bit about the alluvial floodplain system. This is work that I'm taking on with my graduate student, Andy Bopst, who is a PhD student and also a hydrologist with the Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology. That should be an interesting challenge for him to get a PhD while maintaining his full-time job at the Bureau. We'll figure that out as we go. I'm also collaborating with Nathan Korb from the Nature Conservancy, who is the person that's putting together a lot of these efforts to put what's called beaver mimicry restoration structures in place. I also have a little bit of funding, just recently got some funding from the Montana Water Center, one of their faculty seed grants, to start chasing down these ideas. So the idea about beaver mimicry restoration is that beavers are ecosystem engineers and they have a very strong effect on stream hydrologic systems. Beaver reintroduction, this is a picture of here. I don't know if this beaver is going to eat. I think that's an interesting place to put a beaver. Maybe there's a bunch of willow right behind the camera, I don't know. But the idea is that beavers will build these structures in the stream channel that's going to have a profound influence on the function, on the hydrologic function of that alluvial floodplain system. And what caught our eye is one of the goals of these kinds of restorations is they want to release the water that's stored gradually throughout the months of the summer when flows are generally low. we started to think about, well, how does that work? What are the hydrologic mechanisms behind that? How many of these do you have to install before you get a meaningful amount of storage? This is an example of what beaver dams can do in terms of how they change surface water dynamics. These dams are backing up the water enough that this part of the flood zone is getting inundated. All of this region then becomes a region that's recharging groundwater, which greatly increases the area over which you might be recharging the groundwater in that system. And you can also see how these things affect things through the subsurface. This is a beaver mimicry structure. It doesn't look much like a beaver dam. That's because this is in the Centennial Valley. This is somewhere where they're trying to manage Arctic graylings, so they need to be able to let fish get past this. So this actually looks more like a constructed riffle than a beaver dam. But that is a constructed restoration structure. And within a few hours of building this, they started to see this water coming to the surface over here without any surface connection between the two, and that was dry before they put in the structure. So this is just evidence of what kind of impact these things have on the groundwater. The idea is to take this natural process of recovery where we go from an incised stream, slowly the incised stream widens out and starts growing vegetation in the base. That widening continues. You start getting larger, more stable vegetation farther out. Ultimately, that starts in a grading system where sediment starts to build back up, and you end up where you started before the system was impacted. The problem with this process is it takes on the order of an order of magnitude of time to go through each step of this system, or each step of this process. So the goal is to shortcut that and try to get from that system to the original system. And we are interested in the hydrologic effects of that. So we want to think of that huge manipulation, that huge change in the system all at once, like a scientific manipulation. We think that's an opportunity that will really tell us more about how the hydrologic system works by being able to do before, after, in comparison to controls through this restoration process. So I want to talk a little bit about a model that we're using to demonstrate the kind of changes in storage you might expect. Andy built this with ModFlow. This is a really simple depiction of the model domain. We have a main channel and a side channel. And what we want to simulate is an upstream beaver mimicry structure that is reactivating the flow in the side channel. That's what we want to look at with this. We're going to use this hydrograph. The first year is before the restoration. So all of the water in the blue line here is going through the main channel. And then subsequently after that, we're going to divert some of the water to the side channel. That's this orange line or brown line here. That's going to be diverted from the main channel because of the beaver mimicry structure that's put in place above, upstream of this. So I want to guide you through what the simulation looks like. This is a cross-section of the stream. We have the main channel here. Here's the side channel. Side channel is not connected to the groundwater at the moment. If it was, there'd be water in it. And I put a red line on there to indicate the original surface before the restoration happens. I want you to watch near the main channel. So again, we're going to look at the simulation over this first year when water's only in the main channel. Let me run this for a little bit. So what you see is you see the flow coming up to the river. That reverses the hydraulic gradients back into the groundwater, and you see the groundwater come up near the stream and go back down again. So that change in that cross-sectional area is representative of volume of the water that is storage. It's hydrologic storage. We call that the change in storage, or delta S, in a water balance approach. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about the storage. So if you're trying to think about what beaver mimicry structure is going to do to change this, you have to think about how it's going to change where the delta S is, how big the delta S is, and how long it takes that delta S to drain back into the stream. If it drains back really fast, it's not going to do you any good no matter how big it is, because it's not going to last through the summer. So I'm going to run this again, and we're going to let it go through the other years. And this time you want to look at what's going on over here, because we're going to divert water through this channel. You'll see the water come up, and then you'll see it go back down again. But you'll see that between years, it's not going to go back down as far as it was originally. So let me run this again. So first year, Main channel. Second year, you see it gets up not quite as high as it could because it's filling up some of that watershed. But notice it doesn't drain all the way. So we're just going back down to that red line. So the water table in general is staying higher through the summer than it was. And now we're seeing it get up to that peak on that other line. And again, we're looking at a new delta S in the system, right? And it's much more extensive. It's much farther away from the stream. You would have much more faith that this water is going to stick around long enough to be meaningful, possibly later in the summer. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about the changes in delta S. And now, in terms of fundamental hydrology, there have been a lot of studies on this kind of restoration and how they reorganize the flow paths in what's called the hyporheic zone, or the flow network that's underneath that stream. But there have been very few studies that have thought of this from a water balance perspective and thought about the dynamics of that water balance over seasonal timescales, and whether, and then that's what we really need to know if these types of Beaver mimicry structures are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And I also think that this dynamic water balance approach to thinking about these systems is a more scalable way to think about alluvial systems. So if we want to understand how alluvial systems operate in terms of how you add them all up over a whole watershed, this is an easier way to get there than some of the more residence time-oriented ways of thinking about water in the system. Again, Andy Bopes gave a much more detailed talk on this semester in the LRES seminar. He's already given that talk, but this one's available online too if you'd like more details about this project. So I've gone over an example of some of the studies for each one of these and a little bit of the interactions between some of them. This is basically how I organized the research in my lab, and I'd like to continue on these ideas. I especially think that the Gallon Watershed, which is right here, is a particularly interesting case study for this. If you look at the Gallon Watershed, we have our mountain headwaters, we have our Intermountain Basin. In our Intermountain Basin, we have both an urban system in terms of coupling human and natural systems in the urban setting, as well as in the agricultural setting. We also have a couple of human natural system up in the resort area in Big Sky and the mountain headwaters. I think this just makes a really interesting template for understanding the hydrology of the Intermountain West. And I think I'm going to be writing that up in an NSF career proposal this summer to see if I can get some funding to keep pursuing those ideas. Boy, I'm going to have to go through this fast. I'm going to spend about 5 more minutes here. I just want to give you a little bit of a perspective on big data. Another project I've gotten involved in recently is this on-farm precision agricultural experiment project, which has a long list of characters. This project is led by Bruce Maxwell, and my primary collaborator on some of the computer science work is Clem Azurieta. We also have John Shepard from the computer science group working on some of the optimization modeling. So this, I think big data is a word that gets thrown around a lot. It's a buzzword now, and I'm not sure people quite know what it means or what to think about it. I think big data is sort of a relative term. It's relative to what tools you're used to using. Like big data doesn't have to be very big if you're used to using spreadsheets. But big data could be huge and if you're talking about it at corporate scales or enterprise scales. So first of all, it's a relative term, which makes it really hard to define. But in terms of big data science, I think about it as data that requires tools that are not conventionally, technological tools that are not conventionally used in the domain of research that it applies to. And agriculture is one of those. So what we're thinking about is how to apply big data science to agricultural or agronomic questions. And Bruce can do a better job of this than I can, but I'll try to summarize it. What we do is we have data from these fields that come right from the tractor in terms of yield data or in terms of nutrient deposition or nutrient addition for fertilizer. Our idea is because we can control those and because we can measure them at such a fine spatial scale, we can start putting test plots right on the field that you want to characterize yield for. We can purposefully alter the nutrient loading to each of those plots based on the fertilizer application to create data for ourselves that's most useful in characterizing how much yield you get from different nutrient applications in wetter areas of the field, drier areas of the field, weedier areas, stuff like that. Then you can use a multivariate model to describe how much yield you get based on all of those variations. And remember, we've purposely put different nutrient loadings. That's what these stripes are, particular plots that have particular loadings of nitrogen on them. And this is a multivariate prediction of what the yields will be based on that. This model you can transfer between fields, but you need to have the specific parameters for each field. So what you have to do is calibrate this model to that field with those parameters. And once you have that model, you can use that model to make the decisions of where you put nitrogen in order to maximize your yield relative to the cost of the amount of nitrogen you put on. So you're not just maximizing yield, you're maximizing your profit. That has obvious implications to someone like me who's interested in water quality, because as a side effect that will also reduce loading of nitrogen that would otherwise leach to the groundwater or to the local surface water system. So I'm borrowing from my engineering background for this, going back to my computer engineering days in my undergrad. What big data comes down to for me most of the time is thinking more about data management and scientific workflow management and how you automate that. So a basic view of the system that we're building to support this project is we have this data assimilation phase where our field data collection comes in. We have to have tools that will import that data to a database. That database needs to have a structure that allows us to query that data. We've got to do QA/QC on that data to make sure that we tag any data that we should have questions about. We need to also interface with external data systems. We don't want to store data if it's already stored somewhere where we can query it. There's an optimization modeling phase of this. There's the scientific phase of this where we're trying to decide which model is the best to use. What's the best model of causality in this agronomic system that allows us to predict yields from various different independent variables. Once we have a model that we think is useful, it seems to be a good predictor of those things, we can jump that model over to the production optimization phase. And this is a different kind of optimization. This is where we're actually trying to optimize a field for its profit. So this is more of an application system rather than the scientific system. And then ultimately, the results of that model get back in the database, and we have to create a prescription for what nitrogen should be applied to the field in order to create that optimized scenario. And then that has to then go out to the spreaders or the nitrogen spreaders. And finally, this tool has a lot of usefulness just in terms of the data management side of this. So a data explorer for the producer. One of the comments that we've gotten from producers most, even when they have this kind of data, it's very hard for them to organize it in a way where they can look at the history of a field. The simplest thing you can imagine a farmer would want to do. Despite having all of this data, they don't have the technological tools they need just to look at the history of a field. So different aspects of this project involve thinking really hard about how you organize data. The data management system's at the middle of this. You could make your life very easy or very difficult just based on how you organized your data. This is how we organize our data. I made it so you can't read it on purpose. What this is it's what's called a unified modeling language model. It's a way to talk about your data structure. But really it boils down to a pretty simple English definition. What we're trying to do here is describe in abstract what data are, no matter what data form that might take. Our definition is an environmental datum is an evaluation of a variable for an entity at a point in space-time. A datum's provenance is based on its origin. Now those are very simple descriptions of what a datum might be described as, but it really determines the relationships between all these lines on this graph. Like evaluation, there's something on this graph called an evaluation. There's something on this graph called a variable. And the way that English works out defines how you decide to draw those lines between them. So that's a very semantic process of just trying to get yourself to the point where you know how to organize your data so that when you want to query it later, those queries can operate very quickly. What's special about the approach we're taking? A lot of more conventional data management approaches think about datum specifically. For example, a lot of times a datum to a person, they immediately jump to the fact that a datum is a number. And that's not always the case. A datum could be a letter. You're trying to think about a stochastic model. A datum could be a random variable, in which case just one number will not summarize a random variable. So we want a database that can handle any structure of data that way, any definition of what a datum is. The other issue is that a lot of databases are hard-coded to a specific connotation to space and time. For example, the quasi-ODM data model for hydrologists tends to think about all data coming from sites. Well, a tractor isn't a site, and a tractor is always moving around. So it's really not an easy way to think about data if you try to shove data from a tractor into that data model. So we wanted to have a data system where the space-time could be defined, the space-time connotation of data could be defined on the fly. I'm going to skip this one. Just a little more data on the optimization step. And finally, all of these arrows on this diagram I was talking about require software. If we want to automate these things and make this easy to do, we need software to control it. One of the reasons I got really excited about this project is when I thought about these optimization steps and the ability to take these optimization models and apply them to decision making, I said, well, this doesn't have to be applied just to agricultural systems. These are the kinds of decisions you have to make when you're managing any kind of environmental system. Could be a watershed, could be a stream range, could be anything. So when we're designing this data system and the software for it, we're thinking very much about the abstract level, so that what we're calling the base of this system is an object environmental data system, or you pronounce it WEEDS. It's meant to be an underlying framework for dealing with any sort of optimization or modeling scenario where you need to deal with a lot of data, and you need to be able to query it to run those systems. So I want to leave a little time for questions, so I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to take any questions.